Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's NRRI webinar, Pathways to Decarbonization. What can regulators learn from available studies? We have, as usual, an excellent panel of experts in the topic area, and we hope that you will engage with them in conversation and ask questions and have a dialogue about this. This is not going to be long presentations. It's going to be short introductory statements, and then we'll focus mostly on the Q&A and the dialogue. So let me quickly go over the webinar structure for today. We're going to talk about other opportunities coming up and other interesting things going on in NARUC and NRI first. I'll try to frame the topic of discussion today a little bit. And as I said, we'll have introductory statements by everyone. We're going to give all the panelists a chance to respond to those statements, and then we'll get into Q&A. When we do the Q&A, please do use the Q&A feature in Zoom, not the chat. We're going to be trying to keep the chat for our own internal conversations, and we want to keep the questions separate where we can keep an eye on them. So please do that. We're going to try something a little different actually later on with the questions. We'd like to give people the opportunity to ask questions aloud, verbally, rather than just typing them in, particularly for our commissioners who are in the audience today. So if you will first open it up to commissioners and then staff, if you'd like to ask a question verbally live to one of the panelists or all of the panelists, use the raise hand feature, and we will invite you and promote you so that we can hear you. Coming up in future days and weeks are many events by our friends at CPI and NARUC, some of which related to their Electricity Policy Council. We hope that you will consider these as you look for interesting and exciting webinars in the coming days and weeks. We also want to make sure that you know about the regulatory training initiative. There was a slide on the initial carousel about that, and you can go to the NRRI website and click on the link for the RTI page, our new training initiative. We have some courses available, and we know that some folks have been taking them on demand, and we really appreciate that. So the last thing I'll note is today we have, there's always a limited number of people we can have. Today we are hearing from a certain set of people. We hope to continue this dialogue in the future and hear from additional voices around the issue of decarbonization. For example, I listened to a webinar a couple of days ago and heard some interesting things coming from the Gas Technology Institute that they're working on, as well as American Gas Association and others. So we hope to have additional voices coming on to continue this discussion in the future. So with that, let me set the stage sort of why I thought this would be interesting for people to talk about today. I was doing some research on carbon capture and other decarbonization methods, and I realized that there's a lot of pathways. A lot of people have done models to look at how do we get from where we are to meeting any number of variety of future goals, whether it's net zero or 80% reduction in carbon emissions, 100% renewable electricity. Lots of folks have assessed the pathways of how we get there over the next 20, 30 years. And I'm showing a graph now that's a collection of just a very few of these. This is by no means comprehensive. This is by no means the last word on this. There's lots of room for discussion and debate about these pathways. And so one of the things we're going to do today is we're going to hear from someone who does some modeling of these, and he'll tell us a little bit about how that's done, and also why we get some differences. I point out that across these 3 studies here, there's some big differences in how the different fuels are used. And I've highlighted gas because I think that one's a lot of interest to our audience. And it shows some of the variability, not only across scenarios, but also in how things have changed in the recent past. The change from 2005 to 2020, shown on the left, shows that when technology changes, you can get big changes in what happens with our energy mix. So that provides the context to have a discussion. Our second speaker will talk about, given the uncertainty, how do regulators try to address that, align the goals that they may have that may exist for climate and decarbonization with their other regulatory responsibilities in a way that maintains options going into the future because of the uncertainty. The third speaker today will then talk about in energy transitions, if there's going to be changes in the energy mix, how is that going to impact customers, and particularly low-income customers, and how can regulators make sure that they're making decisions around equity and cost in a way that tries to work together with these other competing desires. And that'll bring us to our fourth speaker, Chairman Danner from Washington, who as a commissioner will tell us a little bit about the issues that he sees in his jurisdiction and his understanding from his colleagues. And I think hopefully that'll really kick off the discussion about how regulators view this important issue. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan. Ryan Jones is the co-founder of Evolved Energy Research. He has deep analytical expertise in electricity operations, reliability, and long-term planning. Evolved Energy Research, which he co-founded again, addresses key energy sector questions using energy system planning and modeling tools. And he helps our organizations understand the near-term business and policy implications that stem from a rapidly changing energy economy. So Ryan, if you would start up, I will get your presentation going here in just a second.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And thank you for the invitation to speak today, Jeff, and in our RI. It's a pleasure to talk with you. I wanted to kind of focus in the 7 minutes I've got on, I think, a very topical question for today, which is use of gas in many of these decarbonization pathways. I'm happy to, in the Q&A and discussion afterwards, speak to the broader set of issues. We did much of the modeling work that was behind both the Princeton study that you saw on the prior slide and the SDSN ZCAP plan. So I can speak to both of those if they come up. This slide actually is showing figures from the ZCAP study, which was also published in AGU Advances earlier this year, in its pipeline gas use in the coming decades for buildings and for industry. We've got three scenarios shown here on the slide: a reference case, a delayed electrification case, which has a 15-year delay in the saturation point of our switching to electric technologies, and then what we call our central case. Just a few things I want to highlight to help set the stage. We have done work and showed pathways where we maintain more gas use in buildings than is seen there in that delayed electrification case. So I want to say that, the first message is that those pathways we find to be feasible from a net zero economy perspective, however, at higher cost. And so that's net societal cost. And as I'll get into in just a minute, one of the key challenges as we see it is the challenge of customer cost in this transition, away from gas or towards a zero carbon gas system. On the industry side, I think further research is likely to suggest that further electrification is going to be possible in industry. Much of what you see in the studies that we've been a part of, where we kind of go halfway and then stop, is a function of our of the heterogeneity in industrial equipment, and frankly not really knowing all of the industrial process changes that could happen. One final thing to call your attention to on the side is that the gas volumes over the next decade across all these pathways don't significantly vary. and that is largely because of this stock turnover dynamic in buildings where most of our heat HVAC equipment lasts 15 years or longer, and that introduces, even if we were to start selling a huge number of heat pumps tomorrow, there's a delay there in the kind of saturation and uptake of that stock. Next slide. So a really important kind of question and issue in the conversation we're having here around the future of gas in buildings relates to the impacts that building electrification may have on the power system. And it's especially acute, I think, in the discussion of distribution systems. For residential customers, we all know that distribution costs make up a large fraction of a customer's electricity bill. And if we require changes to our energy system that ends up triggering large upgrades to distribution feeders, we could adversely impact these customers. There's quite a bit of research going on in this area, and these are results that we have from a recent study in Massachusetts that came out at the beginning of the year, showing various levels of both efficiency and building electrification and the impact on bulk power system load shapes. And one key is that if you just look at residential feeders, the impact is even starker. So it's kind of the residential customers, in particular cold weather feeders in the U.S. that where we have kind of particular questions. Final slide, Jeff. So I think the way I would frame this choice for the regulators on the call here is that we kind of have three pathways that we're at the beginning of contemplating pursuing. So the first is this full electrification pathway, where the key challenge is trying to get an orderly exit from gas distribution networks. I would say, based on our work, the best applications for this pathway tend to be in temperate climates and for new construction, where, at least right now in the US, for most climates, new home construction being all electric, if you can avoid putting in new gas distribution feeders, that is the lowest societal cost pathway. The other end of the spectrum is low electrification and high carbon neutral fuels kind of going together. And the key challenge here is both the cost and the potential of carbon neutral gas. The applications where we find this to be the best pathway really have to do with very cold climates. So, northern Maine, Minnesota, Alaska, distributed applications or very low volumes. That tends to be a good pathway. And then sitting somewhere in the middle here, which is, a little bit ill-defined, but I think a very interesting place for discussion, is a hybridization approach, where potentially we have a mix of the two sides, as well as smaller heat pumps with fuel backup. And the key challenge here is gas delivery cost and safety under reduced customer sales. And I think in our work, the applications here where this may make sense are in cold climates. So, outside of, north of the Mason-Dixon line, but not Alaska, right? Mega cities, so places like New York City, where, the cost of distribution deferral can be, north of $300 a kilowatt year. And then for very rural customers, actually, there have been a couple very interesting studies saying that, high electrification is most costly for extremely rural customers and then the urban center. And those rural customers, just because we, have very long lines for that last mile to the customer's premise, and is the reason why we had to have a Rural Electrification Act in the first place. The key challenge here, I think, in the two strategies on the right, are that fundamental rate design may be required to prevent continued customer exit from the gas system. So if you think about the customer cost perspective and competitiveness between a heat pump and some of these furnaces, gas furnace, oil furnace today, for a lot of the country, we're already kind of on a tipping point here. And in these zero carbon futures, we're looking at gas rates that potentially double, if not triple. And that makes this choice starker from a customer perspective and will naturally push people towards full electrification. And so we have to understand, in that case, how do we maintain, how do we keep customers on the gas distribution system if that's the kind of collective policy that we're pursuing? And there may be reasons to do that and measure from a societal perspective, but that's a kind of key rate challenge. And then finally, I'll just close with some of the key strategies that I'm seeing here over the next decade. So the first is replacing air conditioners with heat pumps. It turns out that the cooling side is actually a very good place to intervene in this HVAC discussion that we're having today, where a similarly sized heat pump adds 5% on average to the cost of an air conditioner, just the reversible valve to allow that air conditioner to go backwards. So that's the key kind of strategy of this hybridization approach in the middle. The second is accelerated depreciation of gas delivery infrastructure. So as I showed before, the volumes of gas sales in the 2020s are not significantly affected depending on the pathway that we're on. With a depreciation lifetime of 75 years, as much as we can do to depreciate those assets ahead of time, the easier this cost challenge becomes in the hybridization and low electrification scenarios. And then finally, a discussion of low-income rates and electrification incentives for low-income customers. One of the real challenges here is in a full electrification pathway, where if we have a disorderly exit from gas distribution networks, costs go up, and the customers that are least able to electrify, largely low-income customers, get left with higher and higher gas rates moving forward. And so we want to make sure that we anticipate that and know what to do there ahead of time. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Ryan. Before you mute, maybe a little too late, there was a couple of sort of clarifying questions I think I'd like to ask you now before we go on to the next speaker. And if you could clarify sort of two things. Is there sort of more of a numeric definition for your quote unquote very cold climates? Is that a heating degree day cutoff, for example? And also, we want to make sure that everybody understands what you're putting into the category of carbon neutral gas and what would fit in that category there.
Sure. Yeah, I'm almost intentionally vague here, in part because this definition of cold versus very cold has changed a lot in the last 5 years as heat pump technology has improved. So what we consider very cold today, a heat pump 10 years from now, that may go in the cold category. But largely, I'm talking about the upper Midwest, the northern part of New England. That's really what I would categorize right now with today's heat pump technology as very cold. But even in a place like coastal Maine today, we're putting in Mitsubishi hyperheat systems with, that have no backup electric resistance, heating, and have a cutout temperature of negative 15 degrees Fahrenheit. So, that covers a very wide range of climates. And the second point here on carbon neutral fuels. So there's kind of two pathways that I can imagine we go down here. One is by doing either hydrogen blending in the pipeline, biomethane or synthetic methane, power to gas. So that's kind of a direct cleaning of the pipeline. I will just say that when we have done analysis looking at high blending rates of hydrogen in pipelines, it really does not make sense for kind of the residential customer due to that conversion cost involved and also some of the safety concerns in homes. Hydrogen burns with an invisible flame, for example. So that's that's more of an industrial or electricity generation kind of solution, that particular hydrogen pathway. The other thing there is that you can continue to use natural gas and then offset those emissions, by sequestering biogenic carbon elsewhere in the economy. Maybe you're capturing carbon from making jet fuel and you pump that underground, and that gives you essentially an offset that you can use. And the key point there is that you're still, the cost to those customers is still going up because they're functionally having to pay, in some way, shape, or form, the marginal carbon price, that's there in the system.
Great, thank you very much. And again, as I said earlier, we know that folks are working on those issues that you referenced with hydrogen blending and whatnot, and so we will look forward to bringing forward the latest and greatest progress on those topics in the future. So let me then introduce Erin Murphy. She is a senior attorney with the Environmental Defense Fund, and she's in the Energy Markets and Utility Regulation team. She represents EDF before federal state agencies and advocates for reducing methane emissions and improving gas utility planning frameworks to ensure alignment with climate policy. And they recently released a report on those topics, and that was shared with you with your registration link this morning. Erin has previously worked on Clean Air Act legislation. She has worked for clerk for the Maine Supreme Court and is a graduate of Georgetown Law and University of Florida. Erin, it's on you.
Thanks, Jeff. And hi, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this conversation today. I'm going to talk a little bit. I don't have any slides or anything, so I'm just going to talk to you. Talking a bit about our efforts to think about how state regulators can make sure that gas utilities are aligning their planning and operations with climate goals. And, one thing that I think is helpful as a starting point, and I'm sure, many of you are thinking about and grappling with, is in states or, even looking at municipalities and more local governments where climate goals and targets are starting to be set and articulated, those sort of high level climate goals don't always come with specific instructions for how they apply to gas utilities and for how they apply to the gas system. So thinking about what those high level climate targets mean for oversight of gas utilities requires a lot of creative thinking, and for us to start to look at the traditional oversight mechanisms and think about how to update them. And as Jeff mentioned, EDF released a white paper in January that provides some very detailed recommendations for state regulators. And I'm gonna just highlight a couple of those today, as well as a more recent tool that we released related to understanding greenhouse gas emissions. So I think Ryan provided a really helpful framing, and I'll just build on that slightly by making the point that the credible analyses that we see of pathways to achieving meaningful greenhouse gas emissions reductions involve large-scale building electrification efforts. And so what that means, thinking about the gas distribution system, is how do we plan for a future system that's likely to have decreased throughput from where we stand today. And I think one helpful example of that, and I'm not commenting on the value of this number, but I think it's a helpful sort of framing point, is that the city of New York recently released a pathways to carbon neutrality study that was conducted in conjunction with two of the two major gas utilities in the city, Con Edison and National Grid. And that report projects that even under a pathway that emphasizes the use of low carbon fuels, total natural gas demand is still expected to decline across all sectors by more than 60% by 2050. So that type of analysis shows, what we need to be starting to plan for. And to start at the beginning, one thing that EDF recommends for state regulators is to take a step back and look at the existing decision-making and the existing planning processes that are in place, and think about how to make those processes more transparent and inclusive. Because one thing that is happening and I think is valuable and enhances the conversation around these issues is talking about the future of our energy system involves more folks coming to the table and more folks participating in the discussion. And so making sure that processes are open and sort of comprehensible to folks is really valuable. And one example of that is that what the process looks like for when a utility submits a proposal for a new infrastructure project or for cost recovery. What we've seen sometimes is that there's sort of just a classic way that those filings are put in, and they often can look pretty bare bones. And so for, a stakeholder or someone newer to the process, or even someone, in part of another state agency that's trying to look at what gas utilities are doing, it can be really challenging to understand what's actually being proposed and what the implications are. And so making sure that utility filings have to include comprehensive information can be really valuable. Another umbrella idea that we think is incredibly important is to ensure that there is a long-term planning process in place for gas utilities. And of course, there's huge variability across states in terms of how this is done now, but making sure that gas utilities are developing and filing plans, and one norm that we've seen and recommend is on a 20-year time frame, including demand forecasts and then forecasts for how that demand is going to be satisfied with supply over that time. Just really that starting point of putting that thought process on the table from the utility then lets the regulator and other stakeholders start to weigh in and then assess, sort of the pros and cons and what might need to be adjusted in that long-term plan. And of course, an essential element of that long-term planning process is that gas utilities need to be looking at their long-term plan and articulating how it aligns with the climate goals of your state. Or, even if you have a gas utility operating in a service territory where the local government has adopted ambitious climate goals, is the utility thinking about how their operations align with those local government goals as well? And one example of how long-term planning can start to change the way we're thinking is the idea of implementing a gas investment priority order. And what that does is it aligns the gas utilities' future expenditures with decarbonization goals and also keeps in mind affordability and system reliability. And so what that can look like is just requiring that new sort of traditional gas infrastructure should really be our last resort. And let's look at the non-pipeline alternatives on the table. Let's look at ways to reduce demand before we turn to a sort of traditional expansion of the system. Another important element is normalizing greenhouse gas emissions assessments and greenhouse gas emissions reporting, in particular in a way that's understandable and that's relevant to state climate goals. And I think that there was a 2-pager that was circulated to you about a tool that EDF very recently released with MJ Bradley and Associates. So we commissioned MJ Bradley to develop a tool that allows a regulator or a utility or anyone to download the tool, and you can pick any gas utility in the country, and the tool uses publicly available data that's reported by utilities to then show what the emissions profile for a given utility looks like out to 2050 under a range of scenarios. And so what we're trying to do there is first of all, make that information more widely available and accessible to folks, so you can really go in and toggle and think about, okay, how much biofuel might we see coming in onto the system, right? And how much electrification are we anticipating? And then see what the emissions profile looks like as a result of that, and in turn think about how that plays into the state's goals. And I'll make one final point. There's obviously, so many different things to talk about here, but we think it's valuable for regulators to incentivize and encourage gas utilities to be trying new things and exploring new technologies and new options that will align their operations with climate goals. And we, in our white paper, recommend 4 principles for those pilot projects. One being accountability, which is ensuring that there's good reporting on the pilot project so that the regulator and stakeholders can understand how it's going and see the results. The second is scalability. So pilot projects should be hopefully exploring new technology or options that are, have a real opportunity to be used on a wider level. The third is equity. So pilot projects should not, sort of bake in historic inequities and should aim to improve energy access and affordability for all. And then finally, fourth would be a demonstrated greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So obviously, an effort to try new things we hope would be tied to the overall goal of reducing emissions. So I will stop there. I know there's plenty more to discuss, and thanks again for the chance to chat.
Thank you very much, Erin. And I should have thanked Erin at the beginning for jumping in last minute. Elizabeth Stein was scheduled to be our panelist from EDF. She had something unavoidable come up for today, and therefore Erin was kind enough to jump in last minute. So thank you very much, Erin. And I want to use this brief moment here in between, because I think this is a good point to ask a poll question that I would like, I think will help us maybe understand where the audience is coming from and what the landscape is. And Erin touched on the issue of where do the goals come from, whether they come from the state or a local entity, for example. And so I want to launch a poll that asks, in your jurisdiction, in your state, if there is a drive, if there's a goal for decarbonization, where is that coming from in your jurisdiction? So we'll give this about I'll give this about a minute to run while I introduce our next speaker, Mark Kresowick, who's Deputy Regional Director for the Sierra Club and co-manager of Sierra Club's work on affordable housing, low-income families, workers, and in communities of color in building electrification. He works to transform electricity markets, electrify transportation in buildings, and transition communities and workers to a more prosperous and sustainable future. So Mark, I'm going to have to move the poll in a second so people can see you. And then let's see, we've got about 40 votes so far, about half. The vast majority here are coming from legislation, it looks like. Let me just go ahead and end that poll and show people the results. That's there for you. And then I will get your presentation going, Mark, and you can take it away.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I do want to start with lifting up what my previous panelists have shared. Ryan highlighted that the lowest societal cost pathway to decarbonization of our buildings and our heating is full electrification. And that is consistent across virtually every independent study done in California, Massachusetts, New Jersey, the District of Columbia, most recently, the largest municipal gas company in the United States in Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia, similarly did a study and found the same thing. The lowest cost opportunity for customers to decarbonize their buildings and their heating is full electrification. You can move to the next slide, Jeff, thanks. And as I said, states across the country have recognized this, have started setting targets. Cities, districts have all set targets for achieving that rapid electrification, that full electrification, and to do so in a way that acknowledges the biggest challenges that Ryan highlighted, namely, as the gas system, as throughput on the gas system starts to decline, as Erin highlighted, even under the most wildly optimistic scenarios in New York City by gas companies, a 60% decline in throughput as much as, again, full electrification, 100% decline in gas distribution. Unless that transition is managed and thoughtful and strategic, the customers who remain behind the system will face higher and higher gas rates. If you go to the next slide, you can see in Massachusetts and California, that's exactly what analysts like Ryan have found. That while building electrification and full building electrification is the most cost-effective approach, this transition absolutely has to be managed, particularly for those around the country who are already struggling to afford energy and housing today. So my focus today is to what are the tools, what are the strategies that regulators can put into place, that decision makers can put into place that will help manage this transition. Again, particularly acknowledging the importance of starting this transition with those who are currently struggling to afford energy and housing. I'm sorry if you hear any background noise, those are my children. The most important tool is to start by not making the problem worse. So we should be ending new gas hookups into the system and stopping subsidizing the installation of new gas appliances through things like energy efficiency programs, stop subsidizing new gas hookups through line extension subsidies and other policies. That's kind of just let's stop making the problem worse and creating stranded assets. The second piece is ensuring that any new investments in the gas system are screened against a non-pipes alternative framework. Again, New York City, Con Edison has proposed using a non-pipes alternative framework to look at 100% of proposed investments in gas infrastructure. We just saw proposed settlement in National Grid's rate cases in New York, similarly proposing these non-pipes alternative frameworks. So that's really important to get going in these rate cases that Aaron was talking about, to start analyzing any future investments through these non-pipes alternative frameworks. The third piece is standing up a comprehensive whole home retrofit program for affordable housing and low-income families. Jeff, if you go to the next slide, to ensure that those who don't have access to capital, again, are already struggling to afford energy and housing costs in our communities, have first access to this transition. We need to stand up these comprehensive whole home retrofit programs that include health and safety repairs, weatherization and energy efficiency, and electrification, all in one package at no cost to these customers. That can even be enhanced further by limiting energy burden, for instance, the Virginia Percentage of Income Payment Program, or other tools to ensure that energy burdens are limited in this process and that we're avoiding increases in rent and displacement through these retrofit programs. It's really important to braid together different funding streams across housing, energy, weatherization, health. All of these different funding streams that exist can often be disparate and create obstacles to participants to take part in these programs if they have to go through multiple different sign-up processes, multiple different income qualification programs. It really needs to be a one-stop shop that integrates all of these different funding streams into a comprehensive program for these communities, these individuals. It's also important that this process be done potentially on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, linked with the non-pipes alternative framework for any new investments in gas infrastructure. That can enable what our friends in Massachusetts with the Home Energy Efficiency Team, HEAT, coined the trimming the tree of the gas distribution system. Figuring out what are the parts of the gas distribution system that are most cost effective to start shutting down wholesale, so we don't have to continue to invest in replacement and maintenance of those distribution systems. We've again seen some of that in New York already with Central Hudson creating a pilot to electrify an entire set of the gas system in order to shut it down and avoid continued repair and replacement costs going forward. So those are the different tools that regulators should be using to start making this transition work for, again, affordable housing, low-income families, those struggling to afford. The other component of this, of a good transition planning process and opening a kind of a comprehensive docket to look at each aspect of this, can be to ensure that workers are protected as well, that we're using and reaching prevailing wage standards for those who are building up the electric system to handle this increased load, as Ryan talked about some of the changes in load profiles that are going to be necessary, that we're planning this comprehensively, not just in terms of how to wind down the gas system, but also what changes need to happen on the electric system, electric distribution system, to handle that increased load. One of the great advantages of electrification is, and electric appliances, particularly hot water heaters, heat pump hot water heaters, is that ability to manage demand. And again, pair these investments with energy efficiency, demand response technology, grid integrated buildings will really make, and grid interconnectivity will make this work for customers. So those are some of the steps that, again, we think are necessary for regulators to be taken into account as we look at the most cost-effective way to meet the challenge that we have in front of us of phasing out the gas distribution system through strategic targeted electrification that starts again with those who have struggled and are struggling to afford energy and housing in our communities right now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. I would want to make sure the audience knows, thank you for sending in questions. We're getting a couple really good questions already. Please go ahead and continue doing that. I think we're going to try to address most of those live. We may be able to put some things in typed in, but I think it'd be better to have the answers come out from the panelists individually. That brings us to Chairman Danner. Sorry, right? Yeah, brings us to Chairman Danner. Would like to hear from the regulator perspective as always, and I'm sure he has some good things to share with us and comments on what have been said so far. So Chairman Danner, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. So I do want to talk just from a perspective in my own state. You know, Washington State, obviously, we're feeling the effects of climate change at an unprecedented scale. You know, we're seeing we have ocean acidification. It's affecting our shellfish industry. It's affecting our hydropower because we're about 75% hydropower. And as you may know, my governor, Governor Jay Inslee, has put a lot of political capital into addressing climate pollution. In 2019, he signed a law requiring our state's electric utilities to get off coal power by the end of 2025, be net carbon neutral by 2030, and be 100% carbon free by 2045. And then last year, he signed legislation that establishes binding targets for carbon emissions reductions. And they're fairly aggressive. By 2020, we're going to reduce overall emissions in the state to 1990 levels. By 2030, we're going to be 45% below 1990 levels. By 2040, we're going to be 70% below, and by 2050, we'll be 95% below. So what does this mean for natural gas? In Seattle and many cities in California and elsewhere, we're already seeing the ordinances that ban the use of gas in new construction and in some cases existing homes. So we're already starting to see kind of a transition away from gas towards electrification. The governor signed legislation this year that directs my Utilities Commission to initiate a study looking at how we can reduce emissions in the natural gas sector, consistent with those carbon reduction goals that I just mentioned. And this study has to be completed in mid-2023 with the draft much earlier. And we're just beginning our planning on this study right now. And I don't want to prejudge what the study will say, but I can share with you my thinking at this point. It's very consistent with what I've heard from the other panelists today. And, you know, I start with the notion that natural gas is a fossil fuel and it's sold for the sole purpose of being burned. And in Washington, the direct use of natural gas accounts for about 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So how do you decarbonize a carbon-based industry? And I am looking at this as a regulator, but also now as a long-term planner, because I have just been tasked with writing the plan for how we transition the gas industry into a low-carbon future. But in the short term, as I think has been mentioned, we need to review policies that promote the use of natural gas. And in some states, including my own, we had enshrined in state law a policy that all citizens are entitled to affordable natural gas. And those go back to a time before carbon pollution was a salient issue, or when natural gas was viewed as a bridge fuel. And we repealed that just last week. And our state policy now is that everyone's entitled to affordable energy and not just natural gas, affordable natural gas. In California, actually, this provision is still on the books and has been cited by utilities who are looking to beat back these local ordinances that are banning gas in new construction. And has been mentioned, we also need to review line extension policies. In Washington, our current policies allow for a methodology called perpetual net present value that essentially imposes the costs on existing gas customers to subsidize gas connections to new customers. And I've called for the commission to change that methodology in a couple of rate cases now. I am still in the minority on that, but that is the position. And I think we already saw some legislation this year that did not pass that would have required that, but we're going to keep working on that. We also have to make sure in the short term that we're doing everything we can to reduce emissions in the existing gas system. That means we have to be better at plugging leaks in the gas system. In Washington, we have every utility on a pipeline replacement plan to get rid of all the cast iron and bare steel pipes, as well as some of the defective plastic pipe from the 1970s. And we've removed most of the cast iron and bare steel. Now, I was hearing from others, now we don't want to be investing in this system now. You know, the idea is to change and transition away. I agree with that. Of course, this becomes a safety issue as well as a methane emission issue. And so far, we do have, these plans have been underway for several years, and we're probably going to continue with them. But it is noted that when you are making these kinds of investments, you are essentially adding more costs and more useful life onto the gas system, and that's something we need to deal with. We also, and this is really, this is a no-brainer, we have to stop leaks from third-party damage. Every year, my agency posts the methane emissions that come from leaks on our website. In 2020, our utilities identified some 4,000 leaks that emitted almost 30,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalents. And by far the largest part of that was from third-party excavator damage, although there were leaks from pipeline operations as well, like when they replace a section of pipe. But all states need to strengthen the 811 call before you dig programs. They need to enforce the requirements that utilities make timely locates, that citizens call before they dig, and that we get serious about penalties against contractors who dig without locates. I'm really pleased that the new PHMSA leadership is looking seriously at ways to reduce methane emissions from gas pipelines with advanced leak detection and other things. And this is all very positive. But those are all the short-term things that we can look at, or some of them. The larger issue really is it's going to rest on slowing the growth of the gas system and replacing. It's to get the kind of reductions we really need to do. You really have to transition the gas system itself. And what does that mean? Well, what we've heard from my fellow panelists is really electrification in most cases is the way to go forward. There are a lot of complications to that. And I mean, one is, how do you deal with the stranded costs? We have billions of dollars in infrastructure and hundreds of jobs. And if you simply abandon the gas system, how do you set depreciation for it? Are there ways to repurpose that infrastructure and save those jobs? There's a lot of research going into hydrogen and renewable natural gas and even carbon capture and storage. And I'll just give a plug for the June 9th webinar at NRI on carbon capture. And one of the utilities I regulate has already started a program trying to incorporate hydrogen into their system. But can any of these technologies really be successful in making significant reductions in carbon emissions? I honestly have my doubts and skepticism, but I think we need to let that research play out. As we do our study, we will get more information on that. Second, if we're going to move gas customers to electric heat and cooking, we have to be sure that there's significant generation to serve that new load. That may mean new power plants. In our case, it's going to be renewable energy because that's our state law, as well as transmission and distribution infrastructure to get that power to load. In the Pacific Northwest, we're already seeing resource adequacy challenges. as we're taking the fossil generation offline. The hydropower system is being stressed, and we're having wildfires disrupting power with increasing regularity. But this is something we have to look at. Can we serve this load? And of course, energy efficiency and storage, all of these things come into play as we're dealing with resource adequacy issues. And third, we have to be sure that any transition from gas to electric doesn't cause harm to the most vulnerable people on the system. You've already heard about what the cost increases would be as more and more people get off the system. And it's going to be the low-income households that are going to be the last to convert their furnaces to heat pumps or change out the gas ranges unless we can provide assistance to them. So this is an equity issue that has to be a large part of what we do. And then finally, as we're looking at decarbonization strategies, we need to acknowledge and plan for the political challenges of moving off gas. First, many people like cooking with gas and they don't want to lose it. So we have to make sure that they're okay with the alternatives. And the alternatives are getting better all the time. Second, the gas utilities themselves are not keen on writing their own obituaries. And they have political clout, as evidenced by the many states that have passed laws prohibiting local governments from imposing gas bans of one kind or another. Now, it's not such a problem for dual fuel utilities, but for those that are just gas LDCs, we're seeing a lot of opposition so far and a lot of concern about the study that we've been charged to do. We're also seeing pipe fitters unions and workers advocates opposing any measures that affect their livelihoods, and we need to plan for what their future is going to be. And of course, as has been said, we really need to make sure that low-income people are assured that this transition is not going to be at their expense. So these are the complications, but in saying that, I want to stress how important it is that we get there. The impacts of climate change are real, they're significant, and they're imminent. And the costs of doing nothing are going to be far greater than if we take appropriate action now. These are hard things, but we can do them. And so as a regulator, I want to be very mindful of costs because we have to assure that the costs of energy are fair, just, reasonable, and sufficient. And so we have a lot of complicated work ahead of us. I'm looking forward to doing this study, and I am really glad to hear from my fellow panelists about all the resources that I have available to me and my commission as we go forward. So Jeff, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. We appreciate your comments today. I'd like to go right to questions because I've already got a number of really excellent questions from the floor. So if the panelists would sort of come back on, I want to start with going back to Ryan, and this is something that I think Chairman Danner touched on, and that has to do with the impact on the electric grid of this increased load. And I think there's a lot of different sub-questions in this. You know, gas in some regions delivers a huge amount of energy, much more than the electric grid does during the winter. And so how does your modeling capture that? And how does it capture the cost of that infrastructure that's needed to support that? And I guess really, even beyond that, for the regulators is, where are the uncertainties in that? You know, and are there key assumptions being made there that people need to be aware of? Ryan?
Thanks, Jeff. So it's a great question. I'll just say, I'll mention methodologically, the way that we do this is by creating hourly profiles that represent the heat pump load, prospective heat pump load out into the future. So then when we switch over service demand, we can add that to existing load to understand potential impacts. Now, in those sets of calculations, there are a ton of kind of buried details that I think have the potential to lead to widely varying outcomes from those studies. And many on the phone may be, familiar with that varying degree of the sky's falling, this distribution feeders are never going to keep up to, this is not a problem and we can do some flexible load and we have no impact at all. Just give my own perspective on that. So a couple of things are important. So, we're having this conversation in talking about the US as a whole, but of course, climate is a key factor in all of this. So when we talk about the impact on electricity systems, it really has to be specific to a climate zone and even just a location. Like if you're in the Northeast and you're on the coast, you have a very different climate than if you're in upstate New York. So that's kind of the first thing. The second thing is heat pump technology is improving by leaps and bounds. And if you're doing these studies using a COP curve or the coefficient of performance, saying the efficiency of the heat pump versus temperature, if you're using a manufacturer's curve from 5 years ago, you're going to get a very different result than if you use one that's the 2021 model, or even the prospective model that may be installed in 5 years from now. The final thing I just mentioned is that when we're talking about residential feeders in particular, which are where most of the costs are and where most of the concern is, this question of impact from building electrification and heating can't be divorced from the impact of electric vehicle charging as well. So you really only, you only need to trigger a distribution system upgrade once, which is to say, if you have electric vehicle charging, which turns out to not be very flexible, that may pave the road for more electrification for essentially zero incremental cost on a distribution feeder. The flip side of that is if you have very flexible EV charging so that the vehicles themselves have almost no impact on feeder peaks, then you could see kind of, you could attribute to electric heating more directly distribution upgrades pretty quickly. So it's a few of the nuances there. I'll just leave you with kind of a rule of thumb I would use for estimating cost. So if you look at revenue requirements for distribution feeders today, about half of that cost is associated with capital, depreciation, interest, and half of the costs are customer costs and maintenance. And so if we think about taking something like a distribution feeder peak load and we double it, the portion of the cost impacted is that 50%, which is capital. And just doing a linear scaling there to say, we double the peak load, we double the capital requirement is probably, without actually going and looking at a feeder, is probably a fine rule of thumb. And what that means is we might be able to double peak load, and the revenue requirement on distribution feeders goes up by 50%. And that's what I would kind of use as a rough rule of thumb. But of course, you're serving more load under that, and so that doesn't necessarily mean your rates are going up 50%.
Thanks. I want to take this coordination and interaction with the electric system a little bit farther, because I've got a question about it. That's maybe for you again, Ryan and Mark. But before that, Aaron, you talk a lot about these planning regimes that you see as important on the gas side. What about on the electric side, and how is that related? Are there ways in which the gas and electric system planning can be tied together? Is that something that you've got some guidance for regulators on? How does that interaction go?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one element of, the planning that we think is going to become increasingly important is joint planning between gas and electric utilities. And obviously that becomes much simpler where you have a utility that's providing both gas and electric service in the same territory, but where you have just gas and just electric utilities, that coordination is going to be essential, particularly because obviously providing safe and reliable service is essential, and we don't want to compromise that. So making sure that planning and coordination is in place so that to the extent the distribution system is going to go through a managed contraction while building electrification moves forward, it's done so in a way that, that is logical and sort of aligned with the electrification that might be happening. And one example of this is that there's a One state that has a gas planning proceeding underway is New York, and we recently filed comments on staff's proposal in that docket, and one of our recommendations there is that gas utilities should be required to engage in joint feasibility planning with the electric utility, so that as each gas utility is developing a long-term plan on a 20-year timeframe, part of that involves that close coordination on the electric side.
Thank you. You know, it's sort of a follow-on then for Commissioner Danner. Is there either a danger of cross-subsidization between electricity distribution companies and gas distribution companies, or is some kind of sharing of the cost of transition appropriate or feasible or even legal in your jurisdiction or other jurisdictions? Are there ways in which these two systems can work together to get to the common endpoint?
Well, you know, that's a really good question. It's an idea that I have shopped around with a few stakeholders, and I don't know the answer to that yet. I think if there were a voluntary agreement that we had approved by the state, I think that would be the best course of action. Whether we can compel it, I don't think that the UTC currently has the authority itself to do that, although that's subject to check. But I do think it's something that eventually we would have to see. If we are going to electrify the system, then there are going to be utilities that pick up customers and utilities that lose customers, and it would seem that there should be some kind of a formula that would ease the transition for stockholders of one company and makes it fair for everybody.
Thanks. I want to let anybody else who maybe hasn't had a chance to respond to some of those questions, if they have anything to add, to go ahead. And if not, I've got a question for Mark.
Jeff, I would just add to the last question on cross subsidies. I think the analysis that can be done on societal cost is a useful North Star in some of this, which is, I think there are ways in which you can imagine cross subsidies, which kind of bring outcomes more in line with what is least cost from a societal perspective, and others that maybe move you away from that point. So at least sitting here, putting some of the politics behind us, if that's the kind of North Star for 15 years out, then that helps at least guide some of our actions here.
Thanks. Mark, a question came in directed to you, but anybody's welcome to chime in as well, and it gets to the issues of the non-pipeline alternatives. What are regulators looking for in a proposal for a non-pipeline alternative from a utility? What specifics about the project need to be there? Might there have to be a proposal for different kinds of cost recovery or different kinds of incentives for non-pipeline alternatives as opposed to a pipeline investment?
Absolutely. So I think there are three primary elements, and actually touches on exactly the conversation that we were just having. So the first, and again, I would point to the Con Ed NPA proposal in New York as probably the best example that I've seen to date. Aaron, you may have others, but that's certainly the best one I've seen. Those are the three elements. The first is the feasibility analysis. So a robust analysis of can the non-pipes alternative fully displace the technically, as Chairman Danner was saying, to maintain a safe, reliable system for customers who don't switch off the system. Can the non-pipes alternative actually meet the need identified by the proposed investment in gas infrastructure? So just the basic safety, reliability analysis of, and technical potential of the proposal. The second, as Ryan was referring to, is a very robust cost benefit framework. This is something the District of Columbia is working on right now to comply with their Clean Energy DC Omnibus Act is a very robust cost-benefit analysis framework for potential investments that may be necessary to meet the clean energy targets that the district has put in place. So that includes a whole, particularly again, societal cost tests, a lot of decisions about emissions factors from different parts of the system, both electric and gas. So a whole laundry list of things that need to be included in that and cost benefit framework. And then how does that cost benefit framework apply to the gas proposal, gas infrastructure proposal versus the non-pipes alternative. And then the final piece, as you noted, is cost recovery. So as Chairman Danner said, if we're talking about those gas assets no longer being used and useful through a certain period of time, how is depreciation amortization scheduled for the remaining gas infrastructure? But in this case, for a non-pipes alternative framework, what does that cost recovery look like? Is it coming from gas ratepayers? If it is electrification, are there portions that should be coming from payers? Just a massive so those are the three elements that I think any good NPA is going to have primarily. And there's it's going to take a lot of work. Is that the Washington State gets about 2 years to develop its study. I think a year and a half to 2 years is potentially appropriate. 18 months to for the utilities to actually come up with these types of proposals, these types of plans, looking out at that 20-year horizon that one of the other questions went to, right? It's going to take a long time to work these issues, as well as the legal issues that, again, Chairman Danner highlighted, that in some cases you are going to require a legislative change to be able to allow this to go forward.
I'm glad you highlighted the planning cycle, because we do have a question about that and sort of how feasible is it to make plans that long. And I'd like to add to that how do we mitigate the risks? If what it looks like now in some places, and Ryan has made clear that there's variability in geography, and I think it's also important to make clear that there is variability in the analyses that are done by various people or the assumptions that you might make about future technologies. But if decisions are made that are non-reversible, like this section of the distribution system is old and it's the least cost solution is electrification there. What if we're wrong about that? And what if that doesn't turn out to be the right solution? Putting a gas distribution system in would be very expensive. That would be true conversely as well. If we said we're not going to extend electric lines to a particular area to support greater electrification. In the future, everything costs more. How do you plan over that horizon and try to avoid those very important, those very large risks of irreversible decisions? And it looks like Chairman Danner wants to respond, but I also was hoping Aaron would chime in on that. But Chairman Danner?
Well, no, Aaron, go ahead if that was directed at her.
Well, I hate to jump in front of you, Chairman. I'll be quick and then hand it over to you. I think I would say, first of all, the foundational element of how we address this problem of how do we not make the wrong choice, right, is to engage in really robust and comprehensive planning. So vetting plans in a detailed way, both by regulators and staff and other stakeholders, I think is really key to making sure that gas utilities are on the right track. And I know a question came in about, for example, concern about whether it's realistic to plan on a 20-year horizon. And I recognize that might not be sort of a norm for many utilities. And I admit I'm referring to New York a lot because I just filed some very detailed comments there, so please pardon me. But in New York, we just saw a group of a joint comment from the major gas utilities in the state supporting that idea of doing a 20-year planning horizon and for both supply and demand forecasting. And I think another element of this, which is something that we're thinking through and is a sticky issue, is the demand forecast is so important and obviously drives the investments and the operations of a gas utility. And so it's really essential that we give careful thought to how those demand forecasts, take into account the broader policy framework that's happening in a given state, if that's electrification, but also, what are the factors that might be increasing demand, and are there ways to mitigate those increases, and et cetera. So really strengthening that aspect of this is essential too.
So Jeff, I will step in though. I just wanted to mention that right now under our state law, we have an integrated resource planning schedule where the utilities come in every 2 years and they do look out 20 years and they do their modeling. But the reason they do it every 2 years is because inevitably there are going to be course corrections that they make. We find that energy efficiency is more successful, load goes down, weather projections change. I mean, the fact of the matter is no one is going to write a plan with a 20-year life that is not going to have to be amended along the way. And that means in some cases that we're going to be making expenditures or making investment decisions that we may have to amend later, and that's going to cause some costs. My only advice would be, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and figure that this is going to be an iterative process as we implement the plan, whatever the plan may be. But it is essential up front to have a very transparent and inclusive planning process to get the product you can, the best product you can at every step of the way.
Yeah. Just to play on that last point, Jeff, I think, as Aaron noted, even the most wildly, I would say, over-optimistic assumptions about renewable gas, fossil gas alternatives, hydrogen, you're still looking at 60, 70, 80, if not 100% electrification, right? So in any scenario, we're looking at a minimum 60+% electrification. So I think there are there are inevitable decisions that have to be made here. And the least regret scenario is to plan for full electrification and work backwards from there. And so I just want to re-highlight those components because I think it's pretty clear that's the least regrets. And really, I don't think anybody is going to look at upgrading homes, affordable housing, low-income families, limiting energy burden, health and safety repairs, weatherization, and getting polluting gas appliances out of homes that are destroying public health, and look back at that with regret. I just don't see that happening in terms of the public health benefits, in addition to the climate benefits, the safety benefits of not having gas stoves in a home. I know my wife got an induction stove precisely, for the safety benefits for our children. So, those benefits, that there are no regrets in that scenario.
Ryan, a lot of the conversation today has been centered on cost being a real driver of the move towards electrification, not just the need to reduce carbon, but that it becomes potentially, that the strategies we're talking about are the least cost strategies for society. Ryan, is any of that analysis based on either sort of an assumed value, cost of carbon value, or is it based on existing alternative carbon mitigation pathways? Does it factor in potential reduction in costs of alternative carbon reduction pathways in the future, whether it's direct air capture or the renewables fuel generation? If we're working on cost, how confident are we in the costs?
Yeah. So it does factor in, depending on scenarios, it does factor in breakthroughs in the alternatives that would favor something other than high electrification. Predicated upon this assessment that that the least cost pathway is high electrification is the fact that we are trying to achieve a net zero kind of a, emissions energy system by 2050. So of course, if that situation changes, then what you define as least cost changes. We're not saying that in the reference case, electrification is the best path. It's in the zero carbon case. I would only, based on what Mark just said about the no regrets, I would only push back a little bit, which is to say, I think there are, and Chairman Danner has mentioned many of the complexities in implementation for these, high electrification, prune the gas system as fast as we can pathways. And I would just say that a lot of the devil will be in the details on the implementation side. And I actually think that if poorly implemented, and this is kind of a cautionary tale, but if poorly implemented, I can absolutely imagine regrets going down a high electrification pathway too quickly, whether that's impact on low-income customers or pushback on the part of customers that want free choice in their heating and end up with political backlash against carbon mitigation more broadly. I think there are certainly risks there, and I would just kind of underline the statement that's made about good planning. Chairman Danner made another comment, which I thought was great, about needing to revise plans as we go along. And I would absolutely take a planning process and implementation process that was nimble over the best possible plan today, because we do a lot of these studies. We are absolutely not producing blueprints that should be followed, kind of without update over a 20-year period, right? We know that nobody has a crystal ball here when it comes to the technologies and also some of the societal kind of feedbacks that are going to happen over the course of this transition. I think staying nimble in policy and implementation is absolutely essential.
Thanks. Yeah, I think what you say about the technology, I think uncertainty there is really, that we should all be very aware of that, because right now we are all benefiting from that, because natural gas is very inexpensive due to substantial technology improvements, and there are possibilities for that kind of thing to happen in all of the technologies that are at play in trying to reach our energy future. And a lot of people talk about the dramatic costs in the renewables that they've achieved in the last 15, 20 years, and with the scale that they're being implemented now, and the possibility of comparable reductions in other new technologies. So I think nimbleness is a great thing to aim for.
Jeff,
we have about...
Jeff, can I make one other comment?
Yeah.
That hasn't been brought up yet in the context of kind of least regrets, and just one other factor to consider. So I think that the statistic is something like 9 out of 10 HVAC replacements in the US happen under emergency conditions, meaning, I'm either in the middle of the summer or middle of the winter and my HVAC has gone out and my family is in the, home, and, we're going to have to go to a hotel if we can't get a working HVAC system. And I think that is something that we have to really keep in mind here, because much of this starts with the installers and with customer education, where the timeline of intervention is actually much shorter than if we're talking about electric vehicles, right? Because for electric vehicle, we have, that's typically a more deliberative decision on the customer's part, where, potentially you have longer to do customer education, other things. When somebody's HVAC goes out, if the installer only has a furnace and not a heat pump, that customer is going to get a furnace, right? That's just the way it is. And along those lines, one thing that I really think, if there was one single policy from a regulator perspective that I would push for over the next decade, it would be to stop selling air conditioners, only sell heat pumps in your states. Again, if you look at a heat pump and an air conditioner of the same size, it's a couple $100 difference. And we've been having conversations at the federal level and how we would do potentially a manufacturer rebate to just level, make that cost level. If we only sell heat pumps from that point forward, we can take a huge bite out of natural gas demand over the next 15 years, which is truly a no regret strategy as we continue to figure out how to do this kind of orderly transition where appropriate away from gas distribution networks. And I think that is that deserves a lot of consideration, because I think air conditioners are a really good place for interventions, easier perhaps than on the heating side.
Thanks. That's a very good point. And I think there's great precedence for those strategies in the energy efficiency realm, which is where I used to, do my professional work. Those kinds of upstream rebates, we call them, used to level the difference between a base efficiency unit and a high efficiency unit, tended to be very effective and very cost effective, and a much better way of getting those high efficiency units out. But I think you also somebody raised a point about customer choice, and I think that's really very important to not lose sight of. I don't know what the solution is. I don't know that regulators know the solution is, but I know that regulators are very mindful of it. I've heard other regulators discuss that. And I think that's going to be a really challenging aspect of all aspects of our energy transition, in terms of providing customers and consumers with choice over what they do. That may in fact be the largest hurdle in some of this, beyond technology and beyond cost. I don't know if anybody has anything to wise to contribute on that topic, but we do know that attitudes to things change over time, but sometimes it's really slow, and then oftentimes you don't get all the way there. And just a little off topic, but Commissioner Danner or Mark, since I know you engage with the public a lot, what's the future look like for that discussion?
I think that consumer choice is often it's just a personal preference, but if you're offering alternatives in the marketplace that are really good alternatives, people like gas because their electric ranges just weren't nimble enough in the past. Well, that's starting to change. They're also starting to learn a little bit more about indoor air quality. So I think that it really just information can be very helpful in this regard. There's going to be those who prefer gas to electric. Just like some people prefer Coke over Pepsi, and they'll die on the hill on that one. You're going to have people who want to keep things available to them now. But we're making public policy choices, and we're trying to move the needle on climate emissions. So I'm hoping that the marketplace will respond in ways that consumers will find that there are alternatives that they can look at.
Thanks. We're almost at the end of the time. If you have any last questions, please do send them in. I will say that we will, although there were a couple of attachments to the invitation that you received when you registered, we've had some new presentations and another document on the modeling tool that Aaron described that we will send back out. And I also, I apologize. Erin had another previous commitment that she had to get to before we got all the way to 3:30 here, and that's why she had to leave us. And unfortunately, I didn't remember that and didn't give her a chance to give her thanks and for us to wish her well. So we do appreciate her participating. This may be a bit of a bomb to throw here, but maybe this helps point the way to our future webinars. I think one critique of some of the policies that have been discussed today is that, and I think someone said this earlier, 10% of greenhouse gas emissions come from natural gas heating. I think something like that. And I think it begs the question, if that's the case, where else could we be spending our effort and putting our attention in order to achieve our climate goals? And is this, is electrification the place to start now, or is it maybe it's a strategy further in the future? Are there other things that are a priority that could come first? And does that help us deal with uncertainty and mitigating risk?
So that 10% was Washington State. In our energy sector, we're largely a hydro-driven state. So we have a lot of already non-carbon emitting resources in our energy portfolio. But most of our carbon emissions come from transportation. So we're aggressively working towards vehicle electrification in the state. And we have addressed the electricity sector through our state laws. And so now we're looking at that gas and buildings as being the next source to tackle. But my legislative mandate is clear. We have standards in state law, and those are the ones that I have to apply to the gas sector.
Great, thank you. We have come to 3:30, and I really appreciate all the great questions from the audience. I hope that you have felt this has been informative. I'm sure it raises lots of questions, and I'm also sure that there are those of you out there who maybe have different perspectives, and we're going to do our best to continue to try to have this discussion and to make sure all perspectives are heard here. I hope you'll all join me in thanking all of our panelists today who gave of their time and expertise and shared with us on this topic. We look forward to any of your comments. If you have things you want to share with us about the webinar, please send them in. You can find our address on our website, and please watch the website also for upcoming webinars. Any last words, gentlemen? Great. Again, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll see you all the next time. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.